excellent blog, and I'm back with the young scholar Elijah Emery, who I think is the one person other than Shallon Van Tyne and maybe Elizabeth Lasch Quinn who's read more Lasch than me.
I don't know if that's true.
You have found essays where there were, you have found essays that I had not read that actually answered questions that I had, such as, did Barbara Ehrenreich get read by Lasch, and did he accept the PMC thesis? And the answer is yes and no, despite the fact that people try to read them together today. But that's not here we're to talk about. I'm kind of tired of adjudicating on that one term since it's largely a semantic argument. Wanted to talk to you about the dual legacy of Christopher Lasch again, and we were going to talk about liberals in the Russian Revolution, which is a book that I famously said was not important until I read it, and then decided it was really important, even though it is different from all the other Lasch books in that he seems more ambivalent about which parts of the left tradition he wants to side with. And I wanted to get your take on this as a person who's read it all, too. I've been trying to figure out for a long time what was actually going on with Lasch in the late 70s into the 80s and right before his death of cancer in the 90s, where he seems to flirt with communitarianism, give that up, kind of formally. I guess he gives it up. Would you feel like he gives it up in True and Only Heaven, or do we have to get to Revolt for him to full-throated?
He completely rejects it in Revolt of the Elites, but he doesn't seem that hyped about it in True and Only Heaven. He talks in the section about nostalgia versus memory, about how the communitarian critique basically does this narrow equation of like tradition as intrinsically opposed to modernity, which is a categorization that he rejects. So he seems to think that the communitarians are like, at that point, better than a lot of the alternatives, but deeply wrong.
Right. So as I like to say, and when I had read Lasch more cursorily before I set out on this book project, I used to accuse him of going full Wendell Berry. That was my way. And for people who don't know, Wendell Berry is not as well read anymore. Wendell Berry was this guy who was at one time considered a conservative writer, discovered ecology, and also left communitarianism. And I do think left communitarianism is his brand of it. And kind of soft evangelical religion, and went off, Lasch's opinion about religion is totally unclear to me. He seems to really miss something about the Protestant world, but he also seems to not really fully accept it as true.
Yeah.
So
for me, this is definitely the most difficult question to address. And it's one that I don't have a good answer for because I don't know his private life. But in the way he writes,
is there going to be another biography soon?
There was a guy who was doing a biography at the University of Rochester who seems to have like disappeared. I've been trying to keep up to like what he's up to now, but there's like no record of him for like 4 or 5 years.
Wow. See, I keep on finding articles about him doing the research and him actually talking to Lasch's wife as well as Elizabeth Lasch Quinn.
Mm-hmm.
And who in my head I always make Elizabeth Lasch Forrester because I'm a jerk. If people don't know, that's Nietzsche's sister. But I have not heard much about that. I know Daniel Tutt has gotten more and more interested in defending Lasch as of recently from an almost purely psychoanalytic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And my, despite the fact that I have Lacanians on all the time, my ambiguity about the scientific status of, let's say, well, let's just say actually the psychological sciences in general and psychoanalysis in specific, but also cognitive behavior therapy and. Um, but that's not here nor there. But I do find that there seems to this wave of renewed interest that hasn't led people to ask these questions. They're just concerned about, like, every article that I find about this is like, when did Lasch depart the left? And I'm like, well, the thing is, if you read his letters and essays, he doesn't think he does.
Yeah. He's I mean, he doesn't change his positions all that much, with the exception of rehabilitating, changing basically his emphasis on populism, I think.
Yeah, I was about to say, we have to talk about populism because his emphasis on populism in his early work is entirely skeptical, and he sounds like the
Yeah.
general left.
Well,
In
I don't
his
know if it's entirely skeptical, but the parts he's most skeptical of are, for him, so negative as to discredit the whole movement and the defining elements of it. So he fixates on, like, how in the 1890s there was no ideological clarity for the populists, and that led
right,
them to do, whatever, and how this was the legacy that was picked up by the new left.
right.
And
And
then,
interestingly enough, I think it's also picked up by this, like, new right.
mhm.
But so I'm going to ask you. You can finish what you're about to say then, because I have, because when I read his late stuff, he emphasizes different things, but he doesn't actually retract anything he said earlier on. I can't find where he said, like, I was wrong. And I do think, for example, his critique of Harringtonism and the social democratic left is that it basically learned all the opportunism and, like, overly simple materialism from the populist movement, but didn't learn any of the virtues, and also was he seems to imply in the late work now, and I again, I don't remember him stating this outright, and I feel like I have to read these books every couple of years now, but that the accusations of racism and whatnot in it are both true, but also kind of a bad faith accusation. Like, people are trying to bury not just what's good in the populace, but also perhaps that people have some of the worst traits that were in the populace themselves, and they're like, the accusation of racism, while true, distances them from it. Whereas, you could accuse almost any movement from the 19th century um, of being, I mean, the progressives, for example, super, I mean, in many ways more racist, definitely out and out eugenicist. And yet, that's not something that, yeah, I mean, left historians know about it and talk about it, but in general, it is not brought up in the general ire the same way, say, populist racism is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing, it's he says that racism, for example, is present both in his writing in 1969 and in his writing in 1991. But what changes is the context within which that's enmeshed. And so he sees it as proof of a lack of ideological rigidity in his first writings about it. And then in his second writings about it, what he sees it as proof of instead is the fact that racism can be grafted onto the existing ideology of populism. It's just like a totally separate thing, which to me is a pretty unsatisfying way of going about it. And it's why I think that The True and Only Heaven, while it's like almost, it's one of, like, the more beautiful of his works in terms of its internal organization and the breadth of its, its study, it's really leaving a lot out clearly on purpose. For, as you've talked about, this myth-making effort of having like a unified history of populism, in the same way that what he was trying to do in 1969 was have a unified history of the American left. And I think actually that's the biggest difference, is that previously he says like he's basically rehabilitating populism by associating it with the new left and with a number of the positive aspects of American socialism as he sees it, which is like more decentral, more focused on freedom than, communism in the Soviet Union or whatever. And then he has this really strange section in True and Only Heaven where he's like yelling at other historians who talk about like the fact that populism can only be rehabilitated through its association with socialism, and tries to just like cut this rigid divorce in between the things that he had said were part of a similar historical tradition 20 years earlier, and make it seem as if it's a completely separate historical tradition later. So it's a completely different framing of class conflict in American life, basically. Or not class conflict, but political conflict in American life.
So, reading The True and Only Heaven, which in one sense does give Lasch's own self-mythology, where he finally goes down and explains the trajectory of his political career. When I say it's self-mythology, I don't mean it's false, but it's
augmented by time.
Yeah, it's augmented by time and by reflection and can't be totally trusted, because there's some things in there when I was reading it that I was like, I'm not sure I can totally square this with what is implied by the early pre-Freudian trilogy, the Agony of the American Left, The World of Nations, and
New Radicalism in America.
New Radicalism in America, yeah. What I find also interesting is, while Lasch is critical of, say, the Black Power movement for being too nebulous, and the post-60s civil rights movement, the idea that he was a Heron folk socialist mostly associated with white people really strikes me as strange, because one of the things he tries to do is take the kind of soft Christian populist socialism of Martin Luther King and recast it as a model of viable populism that understands human limitations and the tragic nature of human life. What I've gathered is his turn against socialism isn't even so much an ideological one, or like he feels like Marx is wrong or anything like that. It's that he feels like socialists by the 1980s hate their subject. And I have gone back and reread a lot of socialist material from that time period, particularly, his Goodbye to the Left essay. And I read all the essays around it too, including the Trotskyist one, not just the Leland Rubin one. And what I found interesting about that is I'm like, they really were at that time period, like basically going, well, the working class has false consciousness. That's why they're voting for Reagan. Mm-hmm. They took the narrative the working class was voting for Reagan sui generis, which I think is interesting. Lasch, does Lasch take it as sui generis too?
I mean, he thinks that a lot of the working class voted for Reagan, but he doesn't think he thinks they voted for Reagan because they hated liberalism, which is a little bit different, because he's not saying that they're like irredeemably, racist or have been won over, because he rejects the white backlash thesis, actually, right, which is one of the weirdest and I think worst elements of history in The True Only Heaven. It's just like he takes a paragraph and he's like, this is fake, and then he doesn't go into it anymore. But his answer is basically that, like, the element of populism associated with love of place, love of country, etc., was kind of swept out from under the Democrats' feet and taken up by the Republicans. And because they didn't trust the Democrats to deliver the goods anyway, people could say, well, these two are basically the same, but this one is culturally, more welcoming of me or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's actually his big qualm with Barbara Ehrenreich, is that he uses her as the best example of left intellectual writing about the new class, and he thinks that she doesn't recognize some difference between the bottom and the top on the basis of support on the part of working class voters for Reagan.
Right. I think people also need to remember that the PMC thesis, as it was originally inculcated, was the PMC as a political subject, which is something that Lasch was always just not super big on. He wrote a whole lot about the confusion, like the new left obsession with students in the 60s in the early books. So
he actually goes against a lot of his reasoning in The True and Only Heaven in Revolt of the Elites to clarify it kind of from the left, honestly, and de-emphasize culture. And so you wind up kind of not knowing why he thinks people switched from voting for Democrats to voting for Republicans. And it's just because he doesn't take any account of mid-century political economy. He does start picking it up again in the late 80s and early 90s. But by that time, the suburbanization effects, defensive, housing values tied up in that, it's all happened, and it's completely changed the social base of American politics. So he just doesn't have a good answer for it.
Yeah, Shallon Van Tyne and I, Shallon and I argue about this a lot, where I accuse Lasch of he's a Marxist-esque. And Shallon accused me of being dogmatic, but I was like, no, I mean, he believes in dialectics and he takes culture seriously, and that was his both attraction to and repulsion from the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
But he, in many ways, is a workerist in that he does not see anything beyond that, particularly after the advent of the atom bomb. Revolution for him, the great unanswered question in World of Nations, is Revolution obsolete? And the answer that he gives seems to be not really, but I don't know what it is, and you don't either, and most of what you're saying is a metaphor that makes it meaningless. But you could read him at the end of that as saying no.
At the end of is Revolution obsolete?
Yeah.
That it's not obsolete?
No, that it is obsolete. That Revolution is, because you can read it as him saying, no, it's not obsolete, but it's so obscured now that we can barely talk about it. Or you could read that as saying, just, yes, it's obsolete. No, we can't do it anymore. There is no revolution on the horizon, and everything you're doing is just a metaphor, as a cope for that. And it's actually, having read that essay now about 5 times, it's ambiguous. It's like he doesn't know what he thinks about that. It's a real question.
I think I found myself revisiting a lot of these end sections of the most important essays and the most important books in order to kind of understand the minimal self, and then also understand the apparent turn towards Christianity, which is for me the big thing that I can't quite figure out how real it is. And what he seems to do is, and this is tied up with the whole narcissism thesis, that it's a form of regression. And to get around it, in Is Revolution Obsolete, he talks about how any new revolutionary culture will need to pick up things from the past, basically, and oppose the anti-culture with the preservation of the past and the preservation of the continued reality of the material world in the form of stopping climate change, basically. And then he has a very similar point about what the use is of reverting to Judeo-Christian morality, which is his term, not mine. Which is that it gets around the contradictions of the present by requiring one to grapple with an entirely different set of tensions that leaves one able to more effectively develop the self-discipline and the independence necessary to adapt to the changed circumstances of the present. And so I think the answer to is revolution obsolete is yes, but we can still kind of go backwards in a way, but like only mentally to a time when it wasn't obsolete, which is one of the weirdest answers possible. And it's why it's so hard to thread the needle between, like, is he criticizing nostalgia or is he doing nostalgia?
He seems to be having it both ways a lot of the time. And this has been something that I've said a lot with. You and I are both kind of defenders of Lasch as not a reactionary, which I stand by. But I think why he's so useful for both the right and the left, actually, depending on, well, except for certain parts of the left, he's not useful for a certain kind of feminism. But the reason why it's so useful to everybody else is that his social psychoanalysis and his idea that, like, personality is replicated from material conditions into culture, and thus a feedback loop on individual personality itself. So yes, he does think that there's individual temperaments and that people have differences beyond their cultural milieu. He's not a full Foucauldian, even though sometimes he seems to flirt with it. He also seems to sincerely think that, what I find most conflicting about him is exactly that point you got into, and it even shows up in his critique of the populist. Because while he talks about, like, well, populism, particularly in the early books, degenerating into paranoia, because it had a very cynical view of class relations that was given to conspiracy theories, because it didn't have a view of culture or of like systemic political economy. It was very much like they are out to get you political economy, which he seems to critique it for a lot of the time. But I've read Blake Smith, who is a writer on Earnhardt
and Tablet.
Yeah, not a guy that I think I share politics with, but he's pointed out some pretty accurate contradictions in, like, this writing.
I think Smith is, I talked about, I have like a section at the end of the thesis, which I just sent in, and like my advisors are like, this is way too long. But anyway, where I talk about different interpretations of Lasch in contemporary politics. And Smith is the right wing, I put him with the right wing reader of Lasch, who I think is probably the most eloquent, purely because he doesn't do what most of the right does, which is fixate on just the true and only heaven and Revolt of the Elites.
And that one essay about communitarians that Lasch, like, when he argues with Lilly and Rubin. Like,
yeah. And Smith has this really nice reading of the use of the minimal self in particular. And what I disagree with him about is that he says that there is this really big contradiction between Lasch's psychoanalysis and his populism. But I think that what he does pick up on is that Lasch is too uncritical, as you say, in a lot of ways, of, especially late in life, populism's relationship to politics as a whole and its incorporation into the Democratic Party. In particular,
he doesn't like. I've done a show on this with Rob from the Right. We both discussed how William Jennings Bryant ended up in the Democratic Party before you could even justify it by the FDR alliance, when it is still primarily a conservative Dixiecrat party.
Yeah, and he was the nominee 4 times. Like, he was the standard bearer. He was the party.
And in many ways, he begins the image of the Popular Front that is solidified by the end of Third Periodism, prompting the CPUSA to actually play ball with the Democrats, during the FDR regime, and that literally being manifested during the war.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, I've always wanted to say that's like a moment of original sin because I'm a Marxist and I'm concerned with Marxist stuff. But when I look at like how did the populist left get absorbed by the Democrats, who are at this time, I mean, they're still neo-Confederates in prominent positions in the party when Bryant comes in. And Bryant was not a racist. I mean, one of the things that people forget about the Scopes Monkeys trial is like one of the reasons why he rejects evolution is like having a fight with H.L. Mencken and all that is because he thinks that Darwinianism, as he understands it, necessitates racism.
Yeah, he's like, if Darwinism is real and survival of the fittest is real, then the people who don't survive are going to be tossed away by society. So for him, it's like it's a moral issue, and it's a moral issue. I mean, he got in like a lot of trouble. It was a big issue at the 1896 convention in particular. He wanted secretly to include an anti-lynching platform and then was talked out of it because then, the South would have just completely left the Democratic Party.
Right, and so the original, like, the original sin of the Popular Front, actually, for me, as much as I want to be a narcissistic Marxist and say it was our fault, actually really does go back to William Jennings Bryant. But the other question I have about that, Elijah, that I want your take on is when I was talking to Rob from the Right podcast about this, and not about Lasch, but just about this in particular, I kept on going like, why isn't anyone talking about how the sharecroppers went away? Because that's the base of that party. And after that, you either become a paranoid weirdo after the 1890s, after Bryant, and also, or you become a socialist. And then I'm like, but let's also look at the trends of land ownership. Sharecropping is now limited to a rump part of the South and like the lower Midwest, and that's it.
Yeah.
Like, it's going away.
Yeah, I mean, the social base of populism just was completely eviscerated. And it was linked to what Bryan was running on in 1896 the first time, which is free silver. And, it was these rolling debt cycles that basically eviscerated the economy of the South and the West and caused a lot of people to just flee to the cities where they became integrated into these urban machines. And so by the time that FDR comes in, basically from, not exactly from the urban wing of the party, but from a much more urban wing of the party, he's based in New York, than either Woodrow Wilson or Bryan. A lot of these former sharecroppers or their descendants were now part of the New York or the Illinois delegation, rather than being from the Nebraska delegation or the Alabama delegation or whatever. So a lot of these voters are kind of reallocated, but this peculiarly populist politics really is destroyed by the debt crises of the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, is my understanding of it.
See, that's kind of my take too, but one of the things I find so interesting about Lasch's cultural histories of the left is that he does kind of see that in the late 80s with the shifts in suburbanization, really, the stuff that began in the 50s really taking hold, and he does kind of see it with Fordism. I mean, that's the brilliance of cultural narcissism, is it takes, social Freudianism and pairs it with actual political economic analysis. And yet, one of the things I find so fascinating about The True and Only Heaven, because I used to say that the most reactionary book is The Revolt of the Elites, but you've actually convinced me to read it again.
Yeah, it's very weird. I mean, it's like just, it really is politically implaceable. But anyway, finish what you were saying.
No, yeah, but The True and Only Heaven, not just in its rejection of progress, because Lasch's rejection of progress in the book is actually more limited than people think. It's not like the generic postmodern, like, oh, all progress is bullshit. It's more that, like, moral progress is
is decoupled from material progress.
Is decoupled from material progress. We can't really say, like, to assume we're making political progress because of material progress is just not wise. So it really is a specific reading against Whiggish history, which even most progressives now
accept, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing about progressives now is they both accept the critique of Whiggish history and the end of progress, but also can't drop their moral frameworks that assume it at all. And I'm going to sound like a Lester McIntyre or another person who everybody thinks is a communitarian who wasn't, at least from his perspective, that there really isn't, in light of modern stuff, anything like guiding what would even be meant by moral progress. It's not like we assume that people become kinder, nicer, and better with political and technological development. Now we seem to talk about like the right side of history, but by right side of history, what we really mean is we think more people think like us than not.
Yeah, well, this is the appeal of the so-called universal class, which is what Lasch associates with the PMC in The True and Only Heaven, but not in Revolt of the Elites, which is this class united by a culture of critical discourse and the assumption that everyone can be integrated into its class, but that runs up against the material constraints of industrialization, and then now in the 80s or the 90s, the shrinking of the middle class and the growing, once again, of the ranks of the poor. So basically, it is exactly as you say. It's a limited rejection of progress based on the fact that it's economically unfeasible, basically.
Right. Basically, like, okay, if you assume moral progress is based off this, then you're going to have some big problems because the economy that this is based off is, in Lasch's mind, is already dead, and and we are just living in its ashes, which is always like my big joke about the culture of narcissism. I mean, I was making jokes about it today on Twitter. I was singing.
Yeah, I thought they were funny.
Carly Simon. But I also told someone, no, narcissism isn't the category for Lasch of which neoliberal man or woman or human would exist.
It's Fordist man or woman.
Yeah, that's Fordism. What we would actually be is something like total psychic devastation.
Yeah, I actually sort of agree and sort of disagree. I think that basically the conclusion I've come to in comparing the True and not the True and Only Heaven, excuse me, culture of narcissism with the minimal self, is that the strategy. I gotta let my cat in. Give me 1 second.
No problem.
Sorry about that. Anyway, and this is the big argument against the culture of narcissism from a lot of psychoanalytic thinkers, was that it neglected primary narcissism in favor of secondary narcissism. And I think that the distinction is that secondary narcissism continues to be more and more untenable because it requires this equalization of the self to the institution in a way which isn't possible in an era where large institutions, bureaucracy, strong unions, the company caring for you your whole life, basically, because of the Fordist model, where none of that is sustainable anymore. But the kind of more frightening thing in the minimal self is that Lasch starts to equate the separation anxiety that he associates with narcissism, or that he says narcissism is a survival strategy from, with consumer capitalism itself. And that this act of simultaneous desire and addressing of the desire, which you get from engaging in in the market, basically, by, you hand over this money, you get the thing without seeing, obviously, all the work that went into it, enables this deeper primary narcissism to continue even more unabated than in a prior era when a lot of people did work in factories or knew people who worked in factories. And so that there were restrictions on this total equalization of the self to the market. And so you're right that it is this form of
So the
total psychic
rentier market
devastation.
world, but it would also, in some ways, would be flipping from secondary narcissism to primary narcissism, where the attachment, like the attachment disorder being manifested socially, is like hyperalienation.
Trying to fold the self in. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, ironically, one of my more provocative theses I'm working with on turning into an essay in the book with Shalin is the idea that Minimal Self might actually be the most Marxist of Lasch's books.
Yeah, it both is, and it section where he is talking about this, and I went back and read it again. I was like, oh my God, he's saying that capitalism is our mother. Like, this is his big realization. And yet it's so wrapped up in so many of the later themes. Like, he's playing with myth in this really explicit way by saying that there's, humanity is enmeshed with two brothers, Narcissus and Prometheus, and they're both taking us down paths that seem divided but are really the same, and we've already gone much too far down them. And then in the same book, he's like, we need to restore a Judeo-Christian way of thinking about selfhood. And so what it is it's kind of like this perfect mesh of all of the things which are so confusing about him. And if you can get through the Minimal Self, I think you really understand a lot of the rest of his project, with maybe the exception of The Revolt of the Elites, which is so weird as a book.
That book is much stranger, because on a superficial reading, it reads like a Steve Bannon rant. On a deeper reading, and I say this as a person who's now read it, I think 4 times. I'm about to embark on time number 4 or 5. I, with you, find it to be
at the end, like this is for me
almost disassociated from itself.
Yeah, it kind of it's operating on so many levels. It's like on the one hand, like a more explicit political pamphlet than like a lot of his other stuff, but then like you dig down into it, and there's like in I think it is either the second to last or the last essay, there's this section where he's talking about the conception of modernity, and the conclusion seems to be that there is no such thing as modernity. That like that's the big conclusion he's come up with, that modernity is superficial, because it assumes a distance from the past that doesn't exist, and that there's no difference between now and the past that is meaningful at all in terms of altering human consciousness. And like that's how he kind of like rejects in the same essay. He's like, psychoanalysis doesn't really do much, like basically, which is such an insane thing to say from his perspective. And it's why I don't really ever know what to do with Revolt of the Elites. I'm probably going to be with you reading it for my 3rd time sometime in the next couple of months, just to try to figure it out again, because it's just so strange.
Yeah, I think the Alpha for Omega periods are actually the Liberals in the Russian Revolution, which is a book that no one told me was important, and then I read it. I'm like, no, I think this is important. I think, for example, his calling of John Dewey's utter incoherence shows up throughout his work, including his stances on the war, which I want to point out. His stances on the war were pro-war War One, but opposed to World War II, and yet he's a progressive.
Yeah, John Dewey is like a character who Lasch gives a lot of ire to. And I've seen like some writing, which I can't totally remember, being like, it's only because Dewey was such a great influence on Lasch, which I totally like. I was just kind of weirded out by it. It doesn't seem like that. But Dewey speaks to like what Lasch sees as the heart of the worst elements, I think, of the liberal project, which is the self-assured social engineering that um, neglects to recognize how incoherent it really is. Uh, and and tries to like cordon things off. It's very similar, actually, I think, to like Weber or something like that, like this analysis of the process of rationalization and how Lasch thinks about Dewey, where his critique of Dewey and the war, which shows up again in the New Radicalism in America, talks about how like the conception of the war, like Dewey's conception of the schools, assumes that it can be cordoned off into the sphere that, or this, this little box, which doesn't affect the remainder of society. And that's completely false, that society is ultimately interconnected. And that as a result, you can't just pretend that your actions in one area of life, whether it's conducting a war or building a school system, are not going to deeply penetrate into the remainder of culture, and speak to how that whole culture is constructed. And, more broadly, how the economics of that culture and the organization of that polity is constructed.
Yeah, I've been told a lot of stuff about what I do, and Nick Lasch is at war with Dewey. Like, just there are many times where academics will go to me, well, it's because of this influence, and I'm like, I'm sorry, the plain language of the text, and in this case, the plain language of the text, in all periods of this man's writing,
is anti-Dewey.
Is Dewey shows the compartmentalizing of American culture and political economy in such a way that it leads to total political incoherence and weird opportunism that doesn't even make that much sense.
Yeah.
Like,
and then on the other hand, you have like the opposite effect. I think I see kind of like, if you want to expand this to like Lasch's work more broadly, this difference between Dewey, who's like seen as by some people a significant influence, and Foucault, who's basically ignored, even though a lot of his stuff seems to come up very heavily in both The World of Nations and Haven in a Heartless World, actually, where Lasch is very taken with this process of classification and discipline. And he has this line in his essay on the asylum in The World of Nations.
Oh yeah, says, just straight up lifted from History of Madness. Like,
yeah, and
at a time when that book wasn't well translated in America, I was actually like, I had to do some Foucault scholarship when I encountered that. I'm like, wait, was there even a version of this book in English readily available? I found out, I think there was, but it was brand new. Like, no one had read that yet.
It was super new. But he says in the same essay, he's like, I have a strong suspicion that one could say that many institutions, such as the modern family, also correspond to this process of classification and discipline. But later scholarship will have to take this up. And it's like, here you see that, the germination of Haven in a Heartless World, which then contributes to everything else. So there's these just really funny connections between which people he thinks, because he is an intellectual historian, are good to run with, and which people he thinks should be laughed out of the academy, basically, if they weren't so dangerous.
What I find fascinating about Lasch is because people associate him as a fundamentally American thinker, as an Americanist, and his figures even going all the way back to a revitalization of people like Jonathan Edwards, who I have read more in the context of understanding evangelical history through the work of Mark A. Knoll. Which, by the way, Jonathan Edwards is much more important than that fire and brimstone saying that we used to teach in school. We finally stopped teaching it because even the conservatives complained. Apparently, but I also live in a Mormon area, and they kind of don't believe in hell. Like, That's a whole different ball game. I could explain Mormon. Well, Lasch has a lot of stuff on Mormons in his book, actually,
He
some of which
does.
I think is wrong, but but
He has like I actually was talking about it with a couple of Mormon friends of mine, and I was like,
mhm.
well, yeah, I was just reading this, and he says that the amazing thing about Mormonism is it combined polygamy with a high respect for women. Like he has a line to that effect, and one of them was like, "That's complete. What are you talking about?" Like they just completely were against the suggestion, and I figured I should probably go with their analysis and didn't go any
So
further on
yeah.
the Mormonism.
So when I actually read that essay, I was like, that is a weirdly superficial take. Like this is somebody who's encountered Mormon history, but actually doesn't know it very deeply and doesn't really know Mormon culture.
Hmm.
Um, there's a sacralization of women in Mormon culture, but I think that's a different thing.
And
I mean,
respect.
than respect. There's a sacralization of women in Islamic culture. Um, I also think he talks about the sexual libertinism of the Mormons beyond even polygamy, which is actually kind of true and died out in the 20th century. Um, for example, like sex work was legal in Salt Lake City until the end of the Mormon Wars, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and again, I don't think you can. I actually think it's interesting. You can't really comment on that as progressive or regressive from a feminist perspective cleanly. Like the actual logic for it is much more complicated and much more rooted in a particular concern, um, and also some like sad realities of coming out west with a whole lot of female converts and no men,
Hmm.
and men dying in raids and wars and whatnot. But he also like doesn't seem to understand Mormon racism that much either. Um, so what that's an in the world of nations. That's the essay because I just happen to live in Utah and know a whole lot about Mormonism now. That I was like, bro,
Yeah.
like I get what you're trying to say, and I think there is a kernel of truth to that essay. There's a lot more of sharecropper. I also objected as a like dogmatic Marxist to what he was calling working class because I'm like sharecroppers aren't working class. It's almost a feudal relation. Um, and I'm like America's weird because we just never called our peasants peasants and our serfs serfs. They're either slaves or freedmen ish because that wasn't supposed to exist here, but we had sharecropping, so um, and we had basically indentured mining, because people like the whole company town situation with compelled work was also pretty much it's like that's not. I remember if you read like some of the radical union stuff of the 1890s and like the American mine workers, like we're not even proletarianized, like we're basically serfs. We're on like company manners. um so I found Lasch. That's the part of Lasch that I really struggle with because sometimes he's so good on seeing class relations that are not clear and being really specific about it. Like one of the things about the PMC talk is like he's really clear that he does not see intellectua and bureaucrats and all of that middle tier as the same thing until True and Only Heaven, and he's describing this post Fordist universal class that's
Yeah. But
trying to emerge and failing.
about like 10 pages earlier, he's like, the only thing that seems to unite the new class is that they are called the new class by the American right. Um, so he's again, he's just like hedging things. I think in terms of your what you were saying about how he sees class relations, the example that gets me the most was when he's talking about the syndicalists in America in the True and Only Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
He's like the base of the syndicalists was in the mining camps in the West, where people could remember only a generation earlier the freedom of being prospectors or cowboys. And I'm like, these were terrible jobs. Like nobody is looking. It's horrible to be in a mining camp, but it's also awful to be a cowboy or a prospector. Like this is just completely at odds with the entirety of the established historical record on what these jobs actually felt like and how they actually were received by the people who worked them.
Yeah, see, this is the thing that I do think is legitimately critique Lasch on. He has this, he's right. I will say, for example, for all the Marxist criticism of petty bourgeois virtues, and I think we're right to be critical, I actually do think, and I think even most Marxists, if they're being consistent, lo and behold, for me these days, to hold any Marxist to anything consistent ever, even like the plain reading of basic text, but that the rentier relations that we associate with petty bourgeoisie now would inculcate a completely different set of values than artisan petit bourgeois in the Americas. I was reading that Amigo Bordiga did not consider the American Revolution a national revolution because it didn't involve race, which I think is also funny. He considered it a civil war within the British Empire, but which I like pointed out, and I was like, well, then like the wars, the national revolutions in France and England,
Then they couldn't be
also
considered it.
also aren't national revolutions. Bordiga, you sound like Lin Bao, but even less coherent. Bordiga's a weird figure. Another day, but I was thinking about the way that I actually do think there is a real sense in which our bourgeois revolution is proto-bourgeois, and even Lasch doesn't really get that.
He
But he
doesn't
kind of
mention it.
does.
He never
Right.
mentions the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's actually this weird gaping hole
Yeah.
when he talks about, 18th and 19th century and early 19th century America, like, because he already sees the problems developing in late 19th century America, which I do think is insightful, which is why this is why early Lasch and late Lasch are both interesting, because I don't think they completely contradict each other, but I do think they read history differently.
Yeah. It's basically whether or not, I think the most basic difference is if you interpret how you interpret the pivotal development of a formerly proletarian class in the United States. Do you say that it was something which substantively altered the way that political conflict between, like, broadly construed, the elites and the people? And I'm using that because he doesn't, early on he frames it as capitalists versus workers, sort of, but he doesn't do it later. Or do you frame the development of this proletarian class as merely changing the battle lines between, like, a union of the middle classes and the lower classes against the rich in some way? So it's basically like, I don't know. I mean, I would think otherwise if it didn't go against everything he ever wrote, that it's like, is it natural for there to develop a proletarian class in the United States? It's basically, I think, the early Lasch and the late Lasch, it's a change of interpretation into whether or not they are, for, like, the revolutionary subject or not in the American context, basically.
So I'm going to put on my English teacher critical mode for a second, because people forget that I'm not actually a historian. I'm a pedagogue, and I'm trained in philosophy, anthropology, and English literature. Just a good reader. If you can good reader, you can learn a lot of things. But I noticed, actually, even in the style of the essays, that after Minimal Self, there's a shift. And I'll tell you what I noticed in the shift. Instead of exploring conceptual arrangements of ideas of which classes are organized, so in the World of Nations, you deal with essays on, like, the security state, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, Black nationalism, the multiversity. When I encountered that word, I'm like, oh, we were doing stupid jargon in the 50s. I just forgot. No one told me this jargon. The progressive consolidation of creating progressive liberalism out of the prior progressive movement, which was mostly an intellectual and bohemian movement, with populism and elements of socialism to stabilize actually a dying Brahmin early capitalist class. Like, that's his reading of what FDR actually is. Why FDR didn't call himself a progressive is because he was trying to subsume that movement.
Not as much of a traitor to his class as he seems, is
right.
Lasch's reading.
Yeah, like he's actually selling out newer capitalists to save older ones in an allegiance with other elements of society by throwing them a bone, i.e., in Marxist terminology. And I know this makes me unpopular, but I believed it all my life. FDR Stalin is like all the other European guys in that he's a Bonapartist figure, and that that he is the American form of Bonapartism. And when you hear conservative scholars go after him as like, well, Stalin, Hitler, and FDR are all the same thing, they're full of shit. But there's a rational core to part of it, is where there's a total breakdown of entrepreneurial capitalism as we've traditionally understood it, a brutalization and strengthening of the state that we had not seen in human history since the end of the Ampeak empires. Like, I don't think people really understand how the European wars spreading all over the globe really solidified nations and states as things that were really, really weak comparatively. And you can even see this in the size of the state. The size of the state balloons from 1929 to 1951. Like, it's just like exponentially larger. And Lasch, interestingly to me, Lasch almost hits on that stuff all the time, but he doesn't call it that. He's not interested in Marxist terminology, and I never can tell, is it that 50s Cold War thing where you're hedging your bets and not actually admitting you're a Marxist? Or
he calls for he cites Engels very favorably in the Asylum.
Yeah, I know.
Chapter.
He cites Engels. He's definitely, although the Frankfurt School's critical theory is interesting. I don't want to go into Gabriel Rockhill's attacks much, but I have pointed out that even the Stalinists in this time period are using the same language, because nobody wants to completely own their communism, because while anti-communism is kind of at a die down during the 40s, because of the war, also something missed in Rockhill's article, because they're complaining about people making allegiances with a government that's literally in alliance with the USSR, but that people are afraid that it can come back at any moment. So, for example, a lot of the early Frankfurt School texts aren't translated into English, even though they're published in America. They're kept in German so that people don't get too uppity. I can think about, for example, I think Riefenstahl and Grossman both have work that has only been translated recently, and they were first published in the United States. They're just published in German. So there's this time period, particularly as you get into the 50s and 60s, where people are being really cagey, although they'll cite Marx positively, but they don't say I'm sympathetic to Marxism, because you can't really do that.
I mean, Lasch, he's like, we need democratic socialism in this country at the end of the agony of the American left.
Yeah, he does. Although he also mocks Harrington a lot.
I think what's funnier is that he's simultaneously saying basically that he sees FDR. I don't think he would use the term Bonapartist figure. I just don't know what he would think about that. But he definitely sees him as a consolidation of the power of the old Brahmin elite. And then he also is like, of course, like in the beginning of the True and Only Heaven essay, he's like, my family found FDR very inspiring and were very upset when Harry Truman pursued the Cold War. So I think his opposition or support of these figures is much more oriented around foreign policy and just a willingness to pursue accommodation with the Soviet Union than anything else.
He basically sees accommodation with the Soviet Union as a human necessity, and so and he also does seem to think, well, socialism isn't that bad. that's basically his argument. Although I get the feeling that he would think that, you know, democratic socialism in America would look very different than even democratic socialism in Europe, much less what we see in the USSR.
Yeah.
At the time. I mean, so I think that's why he's so hard to pin down, is because, particularly in his late work, there's the, you know, Shallon interprets it as pretty much a continuity, and I keep on reading it and seeing what there are elements of continuity there, but even in his style. So here's what I notice is different. Yes, the New American Radicals are profiles, but True and Only Heaven, even though it's not a profile book, it's not a book that you would think would be written as intellectual profiles. That's what it ends up being. And so there's a lot more concern.
Especially the politics of the civilized minority.
Mm-hmm.
That and the syndicalist chapter are my two least favorite in the book, because they like focus on these very narrow examples most of the time. Like, you know, he's like, to understand the politics of the civilized minority, I'm going to explain 3 social science textbooks from a 20-year period, and that shows how liberals thought of politics. And it's like, really? Like, I'm not sure about that. But it's exactly what you're saying. It reverts to profiles, and it's profiles either both of people and of books.
Right. Right. Profiles of books are common in his work, but he, like, for example, normally when if you read The World of Nations, about half of that is reviews of books that were turned into chapters, but they always open up to like the entire social history of the topic of the book to engage with the book on the movement of history. I mean, and that's why those books are so interesting. I also have pointed out that Lasch clearly wrote them where there's arguments made not by just the argument in the essay, but the way he's selecting essays in what order. And in the True and Only Heaven, you have profiles of thinkers and ways of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which is no longer trying to. I mean, yes, there's contextualization, but like when Lasch talks about the feminist movement in Agony of the American Left, he's always contextualizing it. It's like, these parts of the feminist movement are rejected, these parts are accepted. They're accepted for mostly conservative reasons. Actually, the liberal rehabilitation of those conservative reasons is actually a little bit of bad faith, but here's why this happened. Here's examples. He does give specific examples.
The early 20th century feminism, just to clarify.
And the 19th century feminism too. He's actually bigger than that. Yeah. Like, and then look at these authors, look at when this comes up. You think about right before the asylum chapter, there's a chapter on like a very specific lonely female writer who's been lionized in feminism, and he contextualizes what's actually going on there in her life.
Yeah.
And like how these letters are like correspondences between women who've been taken out west but not given opportunity to work, but they come from a class where they're kind of stable but they're really isolated, so it would generate this discourse that can be recuperated by feminists later. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he's doing. And then in True and Only Heaven, I don't think he's really doing that in the same way. He kind of does it with the populist movement to defend the populist movement.
He actually engages for his populist analysis much more in intellectual history, like in broad sweeping it, rather than like stuff where he's like talking about like his depiction of the authoritarian personality, for example, which it is much more profile based. But I think kind of like the whole book can kind of only be justified as almost a novel rather than a work of history, because otherwise it just leaves so much out. It's making this very specific argument for seeing history this way, and it's marshaling a number of sources for that, but is very conspicuous in what it's choosing not to do. And that's the big difference, I think, in terms of the style also, that the early works are trying to fit as much in as possible, and the True and Only Heaven and Revolt of the Elites, which are seen as these really sweeping histories, especially True and Only Heaven, are actually very piecemeal in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, all his books, but Haven in a Heartless World, Culture of Narcissism, and Minimal Self are basically essays, collections. And Russians and American liberals in the Russian Revolution, um, which are not. Okay, and Agony of the American Left may not. Agony of the American Left is weird because it feels like it's essays, but it's definitely actually written as a cohesive narrative. Um, but the other two books of that trilogy are like profiles, or their World of Nations is basically, I did essays about book reviews. Let me talk about all the history that these book reviews were alive.
Yeah. Well, I noticed in his nostalgia section, he also just like basically plagiarizes from a Harper's article that he wrote.
He self-plagiarizes. Yeah, that was cooler to do back in the day.
Well, what's really funny is what he leaves out, which is that it's like basically the same section, except he takes out a sentence that says history cannot be twisted for present purposes or something along those lines, and he just removes it, which kind of suggests that the True and Only Heaven twists history for present purposes. I kind of see. I think like True and Only Heaven, Agony of the
think of
American
it as
Left.
a deliberate counter myth.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to read it, and you can see it also in the figures he fixates on. There's I mean, it's divided into two. It basically does the same thing that Agony of the American Left and World of Nations does in reverse. Mm-hmm. It's like a palindrome, where Agony of the American Left is like, here is a counter history of the American left, which is an act of myth making, but it's also contesting consensus history with these examples of real conflict. So it's less mythical. And then World of Nations is like, and here is why the liberal historiographic project is wrong. And then True and Only Heaven you get to, and it's, here is the liberal historiographic project and why it's wrong, and it's about progress. And here is me writing about George Sorel and Reinhold Niebuhr and applying their thinking to all of these disparate movements to fit them together in a counter history. And those two thinkers, he writes a lot about, like if you command F myth in there, it's big in the Sorel and the Niebuhr sections.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things I'm like, well, if he's become a Sorelian, then Sorel is, to me, the most problematic of problematic. I mean, one, what he actually did, which was, I'm going to promote socialism by spreading anti-Semitic conspiracies that I don't even believe. I'm going to talk about the myth of violence, which I actually think is, weirdly, I don't like On Violence or the book on myth, but I actually weirdly think he's correct.
Well, that's the part Lasch rejects also, which is funny.
Yeah, I know.
Even though that's the part that he does.
Right. I mean, it feels like Doth protesting too much, because you are like, people who only read those two books, the last two that we've been, and then maybe go back and read Culture of Narcissism because it's so famous.
That's the I call it the Red Scare reading list.
Right. They tend to have to think that Lasch was always idolizing American artisans, that he has a very naive view of the late 17th and 18th century. Although one of the things that I find interesting about that is, and you can, I'm sure all kinds of people make hay about this, that both westward expansion, which is mentioned as a fact that has material problems, but not as a fact that really happens to people, like that, that involves displacement. And the other two gaping holes is like the American Revolution and the Civil War are basically just almost completely absent in Lasch's historiography.
And I think the same thing is true of the New Deal, honestly. As I've said before, it's there more than the American Revolution or the Civil War, but it's not there at all. And what's funny is that Lasch actually does touch on the 1856 to 1860 period in Revolt of the Elites, because he writes about Lincoln's speeches during the time. But he doesn't talk about the Civil War. And
the New Deal is interesting. I think you're right about that, because the only time he makes a lot of hay about the New Deal, and not about what it does, except in the chapter on FDR and the consolidation of
the Brahmin elite.
The Brahmin elite with the leftovers of the socialist movement.
Yeah.
And the other thing I've always pointed out is, like, in his histories, he talks a lot about the SPA and the Knights of Labor, fairly and accurately, including their flaws. But the Communist Party, even though it's like he writes about people who leave it,
he puts it in Agony of the American Left, and
yeah.
It's supposed to be a big, like, it's in the title essay. It's like socialism, communism, and black nationalism. And communism,
and it's like a paragraph. It's like a paragraph.
And he's just like,
it's like a bridge between socialism and black nationalism. Is like, well, all the black nationalists
became communists
before they became communists, or they left the Communist Party.
Yeah.
That's when he gets into like a Harold Cruz.
But he just ignores it. He doesn't pay attention to it.
Which I find it fascinating, because he's quite right about some things he says about the SPA and its successes over the IWW, and like when it was pivoting left and right and why, and when it was, but then like doesn't mention the CPUSA at all, which was almost as big as of an organization by 1939.
His History of the American Left very conspicuously removes, I think, the two things that most of the American left would suggest are victories, which are the radical phase of the New Deal and the civil rights movement. And he says that these two things, the radical phase of the New Deal, he ignores, and he focuses on FDR as opportunist, FDR as Brahmin, and the stuff going on within the brain trusts, not within union organizing and like on the street politics of the period. And the civil rights movement, he just like says is populist, but is not a left-wing movement, and he downplays the socialistic elements of the movement.
Here's my thing. I think we upplay the socialistic elements of the movement, because the socialistic elements, as like Adolf Reed points out in his stuff on Ruskin that he's been writing recently, they lost. Like they lost in real time. And the only exceptions actually are the two big ones, but the only people who became more socialistic out of the 60s, who didn't go into something like the Panthers or the Black Liberation Army or something like that, are actually weirdly Malcolm X, who moves from being basically a black Heron folk nationalist to a kind of national separatist socialist, but socialism for everybody, and light on that. But he's very, like, if you go back and look, and like, he hates capitalism because he thinks it's because of the rhetoric about socialism really comes in after his trip to Mecca. Like, that's when it really amps up.
Yeah.
The kid starts to thinks that, like, a bit more or less, although what he means by socialism seems something like European style social democracy that's slightly less racist than it actually was in Europe. Like, that's it. That's all.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I agree with you. But Lasch doesn't say that.
He just doesn't deal with that at all. Like, it's not.
But he doesn't give it, either of these movements, a fair hearing, and then say why they're not fair, elements of success on the part of the American left. And they may not be. There's very good reasons to say why both of them are not. But Lasch doesn't. He focuses on the failures, and the unmitigated failures.
So here's the thing. Here's the thing. Why I think if you want to explain why the radical movement of the civil rights movement and of, let's just say, the general gestalt of the New Deal and its radical parts, when the when the CIO comes up and you have industrial unionization and the TUUL gives up its, well, doesn't give up its Stalinism, but basically says like, okay, look, like we've never required someone to be a communist to be in one of our unions. So as long as you're doing industrial unionizing, we're now going to do a popular front, not just a united front from below, which means, and to get into communist terminology, because even I think these terms are even foreign to communists now. United front from below is you're willing to side with people, but only who aren't formal communists, but only in workers' organizations, and only in workers' organizations led by workers are you, not in general organizations. The reason why they thought that is in America, no one could figure out how to you'd even fucking do a united front from above or from above and below, because a united front from above requires you to make tentative deals against certain things or for certain things, but never to support a government and a parliamentary system with a bourgeois party. So you either block shit or you do help bourgeois people do stuff that would specifically help the working class, but you don't support their government. And since we're not a parliamentary system in the United States, that is not a relevant strategy. You just can't do it here. So interestingly enough, the only way third parties have ever really been able to have an effect in America is by voter base threatening, upsetting, and then consolidating with a major party. And that's not just a popular front thing. Like, that's the entire history of even the farthest right elements of the U.S., unless one of those elements can completely suppress one of the other elements. So, for example, like the radical Republicans suppress the progressive Whigs, or actually, that's really the only time it's fucking happened.
Yeah.
Like that's, I'm like, no, it only happened during the Civil War, and that's when one party completely failed. So it's something to really think about why that happens, right? So if you're someone like Lasch and isn't dealing with this, and you want to talk about why that went wrong, I think all of Lasch's culture stuff and his training as a cultural historian just doesn't help him there.
Yeah. I mean, I lament the fact that he has no understanding of the legal framework of the United States, among other things.
Yeah, I find that wild, and the only time he hits at it is in that debate with Leary and Rubin when he quote quits the left in that first issue of Tikkun, when he's siding with the communitarians. But then he says, like, look, the Warren Court solved a social conflict in America that was very unpopular by naturalizing in law, and I think it's not going to go well for everybody because it's moved law from something that's political contested to natural, and something that elites do, and conservatives can do that too, although he doesn't really think they're going to at this point. But I'm like, he does see that, like, yeah. He talks about that, and I think honestly he's right about that, like that the social conflict around the civil rights movement, which I don't think would have degenerated into a civil war, but could have degenerated even more than it did into a Days of Lead-like situation. And the naturalizing the political conflict into a legal interpretive conflict removed it from, like, whether or not it had to be popular and you had to run people over. But interestingly enough, and I hate to say this, but this is something where reactionaries are right, it leads to people not legislating or passing civil or amending the Constitution anymore. Like, that's what immediately happens. Immediately.
Yeah. I mean, there haven't been, I think this is one of the big problems with the New Deal, is that the New Deal never on just like replacing the sitting conservatives on the Supreme Court with liberals. And this is the same strategy that Reagan attempted to do 40 years later, and where we're seeing the fruits of that strategy now. But it didn't culminate in these like sweeping changes to the Constitution, which were still plausible at the beginning of the New Deal.
Right.
But one thing I would push back on, where it's very funny that people fixate so much on how the courts removed popular discussions of civil rights. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act all come after Brown v. Board, like a decade after. In fact, in many ways, the intervention on the part of courts, and it actually is true for busing. Busing is really legislated through the courts rather than occurring through legislatures. And it has to do a lot with the peculiarities of like the way American schools are organized on a county level or on a district level.
We could talk about the way everything in America is organized weirdly because we organize it through a hyper-federatedness and the likes of which the world has rarely known.
Yeah. But I mean,
we even do that with tax collection. So I know it, like everyone's like, Americans pay low taxes. And I'm like, actually, we don't, but we pay so many different kinds of weird ass taxes that to so many different levels of government that when you're only looking at the federal marginal income rate we do, and we don't pay super high VAT taxes, but like we do actually pay pretty high taxes.
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm probably a part of a city, but if I went like a little bit north, I'd be part of a village, which is different from the town, which is different from the water like collection area, which is different from the garbage, administration. Anyway, it's exactly as you say. It's hyper federated in the oddest ways possible. And I think basically like what I would say is just that this put it all in the courts does happen with a lot of big cultural issues. But I actually think it happens less with civil rights than people often say it does, because this was the last major cultural issue that was answered legislatively. Or I mean, maybe that's overselling it, but anyway, it had tremendous legislative and popular involvement, which is not true of gay rights, abortion, whatever. I mean, on the state level, obviously, but in terms of national changes to the law.
What I find fascinating about all these, except for abortion is actually the most complicated, because while it is popular now, my entire life it was about 50-50.
Yeah.
And even now, if you break down people's opinion on what kind of abortion should be limited and not just a yes or no, you actually have like 20 something like that, like breakdowns on what people think is okay. And I find that to be expected, actually, to some degree, because I think that's an issue where it's easier to argue now that there's been, decades of it existing. And I think it's important, but I also have pointed out that like kind of what the Supreme Court has done is something that Lasch would probably have picked up on, that it's like, well, the Supreme Court has politicized it in a way that's actually good for everybody, because while one side can claim a victory that it couldn't claim, it can't claim it in every state. And it does actually give Democrats in non-blue states a reason to vote. So there's a cynical reason why you like what people go like, why do the Democrats do anything about it? I'm like, well, didn't they win the midterm? I mean, like, well, they didn't win the midterms. Let's be honest. They just didn't lose as bad as we all historically expected them to. But they did significantly better than anybody would have predicted pre-Roe being reversed. And I think Lasch would be on to the cynical side of that. What I don't think he would see, particularly in late Lasch, is, like I said, there's just bracketing out a political economy and manifested in economics selectively. Like we talked about, he's very good on it, and when he's talking about the 70s and parts of the 80s. He's talking about
especially the relationship between foreign affairs and domestic industrial needs.
Right. But he's bad on it when he's talking about the 17th, 18th century, 19th century. And the other thing that he brackets out that I think is super interesting is exactly what you're talking about. Law is not talked about in him except in like 4 essays, and it's kind of cursory.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I agree with you on by the way, on civil rights, because the Civil Rights Amendment is when that all ends and the legislative advantages stop. But but what I will say is we don't have enough power, even with the legislative advantages of the Civil Rights Movement, to really push a constitutional change of any significance. Like there are amendments after Brown v. Board, but there's not that many, and they're like super superficial.
Well, the amendments after Brown v. Board are like the entirety of the. I think you mean. Are you talking about just after the Civil Rights Act? Like
after the Civil Rights Act, yeah.
No, I think like the other thing is that it's not really remanded to the courts as much as it's remanded to within the bureaucracy. So like within the EEOC, within state level investigative bodies,
within the judicial creation of the administrative state prerogative, which here's the thing.
Which he touches on because he's talking about it in Culture of Narcissism. Exactly that thing, the effect of the interplay between federal lawmaking and rulemaking and corporatism in its American form. But he's not formalizing it or picking up where exactly it's emanating from or why exactly it was established beyond like vaguely talking about, to defend the power of the Brahmin class and its later forms.
Right. I think this is actually something we need to kind of pick apart, and we'll do it another day. But I think that's an interesting observation because I've become increasingly convinced that Marxists, and this is not just Lasch, do not take law seriously as part of the base of production.
That's why I'm going to law school, for exactly that reason.
Because money, contract law, a lot of the limitations of businesses, a lot of the ways we talk about capitalism changing from mercantile capitalism to entrepreneurial capitalism and the settler colonial period into, I would say, mercantile proto-capitalism into agrarian settler capitalism and then into industrial capitalism. Those are developments of technology, but the later changes, and I know people are, and I don't think they come, this is where it gets complicated. I don't think they come from the law. Neoliberalism is not a political project imposed upon people the way someone like David Harvey says. It is a development of things that were already beginning during Fordism, expanded out because the public-private partnerships have already begun, all the way back to the New Deal, frankly. And what has changed is workers have an informal but real seat at the table. It's not an equal one, but they are considered kind of the wobbly leg of a three-part stool. And as profits change, they're cut out. But what I've also pointed out, the more I've really seen this is all also reflected in changes in law.
Yeah,
and in legal interpretation.
One thing about that is it lags behind. So, like, for example, the Clinton welfare bill is in the 90s, right? And this is what people commonly associate actually with the end of New Deal welfarism. Like that is the legal end of New Deal welfarism. It's not under Reagan, it's not under Bush, it's under Clinton. And it's because the underlying structure has already been removed.
Right. And so now we're just formalize it in law, and a nominally left liberal party will put an imperative on it. Which, by the way, if you read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, a book that I am on record over and over again of being obsessed with hating for now 15 years, I point out that Klein actually shows this happening in multiple countries. This is not unique to the United States, nor is it imposed by the United States in all instances. And in some cases, like the case of Sweden, or the case of, say, parts of Nicaragua's neoliberalization, the neoliberalization is achieved more easily because the public-private suspension into the state welfare was already there. and there's so much state power assumed by the leftist forces that they can push it in ways that, say, Pinochet actually couldn't. And the reason why I hate that book is like making it sound like it was a conspiracy of people who backed Pinochet, and yes, the Chicagoans were involved, and yes, that's real, completely cuts out the fact that even in her own description, the legal changes are formalized under nominally left liberal and sometimes nominally socialist regimes. And so,
and it's because they're reactive, in my opinion. They're not
right.
They're not active.
Well, this is, I mean, here's the thing: law is always the most conservative element of the state. Like, and by that I don't mean it is conservative in content. I mean that it exists to codify things that are already happening, or it exists to protect the status quo. Literally, that's what rule of law means, is a stable status quo.
Yeah.
The reason why people don't the reason why you don't want rule of law to break down is because the status quo breaks down so much that you have stasis, to use a Greek term. Stasis encourages out and direct political conflict, so war by other means just becomes social and civil war. But that is the whole, R in the case if you're a Marxist and there's a class base or some other political subject, it's a revolution. The point about that is that's like something that people, I think, are rightly afraid of, why they like rule of law, and why we always think of law as kind of, I think a lot of liberals think of law as a progressive force. But one thing I think Lasch is right about is we're drawing that opinion from a time period in American history that's actually quite rare.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think he might be right that the victories of the civil rights movement are not left-wing, but not in the way he sees it. They're not left-wing because they don't really interpenetrate into the social realm beyond education. And by social, I also mean like social welfare. The denuding of social from its economic context is like a post-1980s phenomenon, even in America. We didn't used to say social conservative to mean like, I'm socially conservative, but economically liberal. That phrase would not have made sense before the late 1970s. It just wouldn't have been, it would have been a nonsense phrase. Kind of like when you encounter neoliberalism in World of Nations and you realize he means something completely different than what he means by neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And the true and only heaven, which is neoliberalism like we mean it. And I had to go and look stuff up and what were people meaning by neoliberalism in 1967? Because it was not
the Kennedy administration.
Right.
They're like, liberalism is back, baby, after the quiet Eisenhower years.
Right. But it's also interesting because I'm like, and he talks about the movement of the left. I mean, there is a truth in that book where he talks about the radical left gets a lot of its energy actually not from the Soviet Union, but from this weird movement where there's stuff happening in the third world, but also the Kennedy administration happens and everyone's excited about that. And that those things happen together. And they're somehow, even though they're kind of directly opposed,
they're complementary to the psyche of the student revolutionaries.
Right. It's like the welding of revolution as metaphor from national liberation movements is something. I don't know. I'm going to end you with this thought. Lasch is often interesting in that how much of a Marxist framework he picks up, but particularly in World of Nations, he describes things that Marxists would describe, like we would have the debate on whether or not the national liberation movements are socialist revolutions or bourgeois revolutions. They're bourgeois revolutions. And Lasch sees that, but he doesn't see it in those terms. He's like, well, these regimes are going to have to be neo-developmentalist, and they're going to have to be actually integrated into one of the blocks of geopolitics, and so they can't be models for revolutionaries or even radical politics in the core, because there's no way for that to happen, and there's no occupation for you to overthrow. And I think Lasch is even more right than he even knows, but he doesn't frame it I kept when I explain that essay, I always explain it in Marxist terms, but then I have to go back and say that's not actually what he says. Here's what he says.
I saw this poll on Twitter, which was like, which of the branches of Marxism is the most dead right now? It was like Frankfurt School Marxism, Gramscian Marxism. It had a couple of others, and I often wonder how much of this is impenetrable to me because I don't have a good handle on Gramsci, who is that's the branch of Marxism that's the most influential on Lasch's thinking.
Yeah, and it's also the one that's hardest to understand because it's not even fully translated, and a lot of like Gramscian thinking is actually projected by later thinkers.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
Yeah.
Gramsci's the one that all the right wingers have a boner for because they actually believe in cultural hegemony the way that Gramsci describes it, which I have always actually seen as a strike against Gramsci. It's kind of like my problems with the Frankfurt School. I'm like, yeah, reactionaries like Richard Spencer read the culture industry and got all wet about it. I don't know what's good. In fact, my other thing is I do think after Pollock, and I don't want to slander Pollock. I actually think Pollock's an important thinker, and Lasch doesn't pay enough attention to him in his critique of the authoritarian personality. But that Frankfurt Schoolers are too anti-working class because, as I've had other people point out, that there's another study that used the same parameters done by American sociologists at the same time, and it actually found findings that were more consistent with Marxism than the Frankfurt School findings. That no, actually, working class people aren't particularly more authoritarian. It's really varied, and there's no personality clearly associated with it, although it does seem to be particular to kind of upper middle class thinking. And I find that interesting. I guess we end on there are left-wing elements to the end of Lasch's life, but a lot of this shit's weird.
Basically.
And it's opaque because I feel like the man was so productive that and so selective that while I get more out of him than I get out of, say, David Graeber, I actually have a lot of the same. This challenge is going to be so mad at me about saying this, but I actually have some of the same problems with Lasch that I do about David Graeber. That he's motivated, particularly in his late work, with coming up with a counter narrative myth, and one that isn't oh, I'm going to show you the problems of the left and take off your rose-colored glasses. Something that I'm, or pink-wash glasses in this case. Something I'm very sympathetic to, actually. I think he's mostly right in those books, honestly, even about stuff like the collective actor problem with Black nationalism and stuff about when you compare yourselves to other nationalisms that have a nation far away that they're supporting and they're trying to integrate as a diaspora movement, it's kind of a different thing than trying to have a nation within a nation that's a break off of a nation, but also maybe stays in it at the same time, depending on whether or not you're a cultural or political Black nationalist. And I think that's a fair critique. It's also an obvious one. It's it's so obvious that it doesn't get made, and I think people forget about it. But I just find the end stuff so confusing.
Yeah.
Because I also don't. I mean, I still think you would agree with me that you don't think Lasch is an out and out reactionary.
Definitely not.
Or even a conservative.
No. He's barely. The thing that would most point him in that direction is just becoming religious, and that's not even clear, right?
Right. His stuff about and what he values in the Judeo-Christian culture is like a integrated sense of self, a la Lester McIntyre.
Yeah, he's it's very demanding.
Right, and the demands will actually, even if you don't become a good Christian, you will have an integrated personhood because of the conflict of that kind of discipline on yourself.
He's he has a line in Revolt of the Elites. It's an honest atheist is always to be preferred to a fake Christian or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's it's a matter of honesty and
then that he reminds me of John Gray, who's always in his 5 Types of Atheists book, where he's just most atheists suck.
Who wrote one of the book covers of Revolt of the Elites?
Yeah, also. I know. I mean, John Gray's John Gray's one of my fascinations because he's too cantankerous even to be a paleo conservative.
I love his quote. I was reading something of his from writing about the Thatcher administration, and he's like, "I love Thatcher because the Thatcherites were the closest thing we had in England to Bolsheviks."
Yeah, I mean, it's he. One day I need to have a symposium because I've read most of his books, and I can tell you what dark Varn is. If I give in to despair, my conservative impulse will come back, and I will be John Gray. I will not even be recognized with most people as a conservative because I will hate conservatives for being too fucking liberal and Christian. Anyway, like the thing about John Gray, as a crazy note, is he's a conservative socialist, and I mean that, and he's extremely conservative and extremely socialistic, but he's one of the few that's not from an aristocratic background. It's from pure misanthropy. Like, he's like, people need help. Maybe the state can kind of do it because maybe people are less dumb if their needs are met, but they're always going to be stupid, and this is always going to fail. Like, that's his attitude.
Yeah,
Like,
Lasch gives people a lot more credit than John Gray does.
right. Like that's the other thing. Lasch doesn't actually. I mean, I don't love the biography about him that's readily available because it's clearly written from a religious conservative perspective.
But the guy, to his credit, I've listened to a couple of interviews by the guy, and his conclusion is like, well, ideologically, you just can't put Lasch anywhere, which is like a lot more honest than like trying to slot him into the conservative project.
Like Roger Campbell tries to do since like he's been trying to do that since Lasch died.
Yeah,
like,
which is completely like not true.
Which is also why for the longest time the only people who talked about Lasch were conservatives, and then unfortunately, and I do play a role in this, although I'm not the person who told Angela Nagel to read it, but Angela Nagel and I, when we'd never actually directly talked ever, I've just read her stuff, corresponded with, like, we both like Christopher Lasch, and no one remembers who he was, and then the lead up to Trump happening, and like everybody, including the Red Scare people and the Claremont Institute, and like everybody's all back over Christopher Lasch again. And at first I'm actually kind of excited. Then I'm getting what they're reading from, and I'm like, where did you get that? Like,
yeah. I mean, I just spent a while reading for the first time, like every major essay published on it in the past like 10 years, 15 years.
Okay, so you might have read more, because I have actually only cracked I've read like 15. So
there's only 15. There's not any.
Good.
There's so few of them, and it's really like he's talked about a lot more than he's written about. But I have a strong suspicion, because I've talked to a couple of guys.
I have a strong suspicion a lot of people talk about him don't read him, and the only thing you have the Revolt of the Read. There's a bunch of blog posts about the Tikkun One exchange where he gets really mad at the right, and then at the end, the Trotskyist and Lenin Rubin responds to him, and he like freaks out and says like the left is, not to sound like the platypus affiliated society, basically said the left is dead and doesn't even know it, and I'm not. Yeah. I can't really be associated with that anymore. Like. So,
for me, what's way more worrying is the people reading him behind closed doors in the right and discussing him.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
So, like, I talked to somebody who's now with J.D. Vance's people, who was very, very into Lasch, but he also, to his credit, he was like, no, he's a socialist, which is very funny.
I was reading the comments to Blake Smith's article on Unheard, and not that I love Unheard, but I was like reading it, and I'm like, holy crap! There's like this like bunch of people reading Lasch on the right with like an interpretive rubric that only reads Culture of Narcissism through the Revolt of the Elites, doesn't know anything about the early stuff. Maybe they kind of skim Agony of the American Left because they don't they think that's just trying to own the left, which it's not trying to do. And their interpretive rubric is really weird. And I also remember that I read Julian Asselle's essay about him breaking from Lasch, and I remember writing him and going like, "Where do you get this interpretation of Lasch?
Yeah.
Like, you're breaking from an interpretation of Lasch that I just don't recognize."
Yeah.
And then I'm like, but if I was reading True and Only Heaven and Revolt of the Elites only, and I was reading it with a weird guide like the Claremont Institute or like some reactionary priest I know or something, I probably could get what he got out of it.
I mean, I kind of understand it because I read True and Only Heaven and then Revolt of the Elites in 2020, where like the things that were really at the forefront were identity politics stuff. Like when I was reading it, basically, and bridging the gap between like what the distinction between populism is and how it relates to like a cultural context. And then I went back and continued reading it, and now my conclusions about what all these books mean is completely different. But I think it basically comes down to that there are entirely different languages spoken between each of the four main groups reading Lasch, who I can kind of go over now.
Yeah, let's end the night on this. Who do you think are reading Lasch, and what are their basic interpretive rubrics?
So these are my groupings of it. There's the New Right and the post-liberal elements of the New Right. And this includes most prominently Patrick Deneen. It also includes Blake Smith and Jeff Schellenberger. And then on the other hand, it sort of includes the people at the Front Porch Republic, and a lot of people who are like vaguely communitarian, vaguely post-liberal.
I've read some of the Front Porch stuff. Also, though, we need to be very specific. They're right-wing communitarian. Like they're
they are.
They're not just normal because like because I do like pointing out that like if you were like Charles Taylor, who's a communitarian, he's not a right-winger. Or Michael Sandel, who is not a left-winger, but also not a right-winger. He really likes China, for example.
Yeah. This group basically fixates on Lasch as like think of Lasch's conception of religion, actually. It overemphasizes it, but they do expound upon it and privilege the late writings over the middle ones, and then just completely ignore the early ones and fail to recognize any similarities between Lasch's psychoanalysis and his religious conception. And then it's also integrated into the like Lasch as pure populist, which is what comes up in the Front Porch Republic. And it's a vision of populism, which, as you say, is very right, communitarian. And then you often find that a lot of the people who are more practical, I would put Blake Smith and Jeff Schellenberger in this. They're connected to like more vibrant intellectual projects. Kind of de-emphasize Lasch. They say he left the left. They point to a couple of tensions within him, but they don't really go into as much detail as a lot of the post-liberals do, because they recognize that his project is not their project, is my suspicion.
Right.
Then there's like the post-left, sort of.
I also want to emphasize that, like, interestingly, the people who leave Lasch and have that reading are Jewish. But
of the which reading? The reading
Blake
of
Smith. I mean, like I don't know when Tablet went from being like BuzzFeed for Jews into being a conservative outlet, which seems to have happened slowly over the course of about like 9 years.
Yeah,
because I remember liking Tablet actually at one point in my life. But
I still I read Tablet and then I read Jewish Currents, and it makes me very confused.
Yes. Yes, it does.
But yeah, I
yeah.
actually think I would kind of separate Smith, because I think he actually, as I've said earlier, does actually have a pretty good reading of Lasch. He doesn't go into, I think his reading contextually is wrong in terms of like how he can combine it with the political project he seems to be interested in. But I don't think he's lying about anything, which is different in my mind from like, especially what the Front Porch Republic does. But anyway, I think then there's also like the post left, which is like, and it's probably best picked up in just like talking about Red Scare and things associated with Red Scare. And what this does is it reduces Lasch to a critique of identity politics, and focuses Lasch
and a critique of
on
liberalism as only identity politics too. That's another thing.
Exactly.
Like they seem to reduce liberalism just to identity politics, which is weird.
And it combines a reading of Revolt of the Elites and Culture of Narcissism, and doesn't seem to focus on anything else. Not even True Nonly.
Doesn't read Minimal Self. Yeah, and
doesn't
yeah,
really
also
read Minimal Self. And I think that's an incorrect reading, and it's frankly a pretty narcissistic reading. I think a good example of this like shrinking Lasch and then deploying him strategically is, I don't know if you know Emmett Penny, who he wrote an article called The Revolt of the Green Elites in Compact. And I think it's a pretty good article. I don't think it misrepresents Lasch that much, honestly. I've talked to him a couple of times. But I think what it does is it deploys Lasch within discussions of like environmentalist politics and nuclear energy, which Lasch just didn't write about. And I think that replicates.
Yeah, and that's Emmett Penny's like pet cause too.
It's his shtick.
Nuclear barbarianism. That's his fucking handle on Twitter.
Exactly. And it replicates in miniature a lot of what the post-left associated people do, which is they take Lasch, they put him in this context that he didn't really write about, identity politics, and then strategically deploy him on those terms.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do that with Marx too. I mean, like the way they read Marx's relationship to the left tradition is like basically an argument from absence, except that there actually is evidence that Marx associated himself with the left tradition. Like, but their argument is mostly this one time Marx was really annoyed with socialists, so he doesn't use that word here. I'm like, yeah, but he does other places.
Yeah.
Like, and particularly with some of the people who are European and like speak the languages this stuff is written in, I'm like, and you have to know it. Like, or you're really reading selectively, because you can't blame it on a translation error. You can read it in the original. Like,
yeah.
Anyway,
no, so that's their thing basically.
And then there's like me and Tut.
You guys are the last group. I have one group in between.
Okay.
So first I have the center, which is like the Axios article on Steve Bannon, but also earlier the attempt to deploy Lasch as like, is Barack Obama a Laschian conservative? Is this like article from 2008 that Andrew Sullivan published?
Yeah,
the Daily Dish.
Weirdly, there's this. I also, God, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but Kevin Mason, who is Lasch's student, I see as this, but from the slightly more pro-Obama side. Like,
yeah,
was Lasch critiquing the narcissism that leads to Trump? Like, it's both centrist. Like, the difference between them is like that Andrew Sullivan's way more annoying and less punk, but also like one of them's a D and one of them is sometimes an R.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think basically like the centrist engagement is super limited. It doesn't seem to really delve into him as a thinker. It just is like, this is the thing everybody knows about him. And here are like a couple of quotes that are, split off from anything else and just exist in a vacuum. And there's this awareness that he's important, but not an awareness of why or what that means. And in the final grouping,
I wouldn't say that about Mason, honestly, but
I'd say that
you
about,
didn't include him. I included him. So, Sullivan, who else would you include in that list, though?
It's very, very small. Like there was an article in the New York Times earlier this year in 2022 that was some on the left turn on the label progressive, which mentioned the true and only heaven and like, is progress the goal? But it was just like, Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and Hillary Clinton called herself not a democratic socialist. So
Yeah, I
he was
mean,
just kind of there.
it's New York Times stupid. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and that's basically how it like comes up. I think like another good example of this is
Whenever
when
I'm sympathetic to the revolt of the elites is when I read the New York Times. But go ahead.
yeah, perfect. Or like when Eric Levitz got into Lasch very briefly on Twitter, and he's like, "This is an interesting book," and then he just like never dealt with it again. But he did mention it in like a couple of tweets. So the main point about the center is that there's not very much engagement, and then finally there's the left, which is, I chose to define very broadly. So it includes
It's split
you and
between
Tut.
super fucking hostile and then like me and Tut and like
Yeah.
Shallon Bontellian and I guess Sam Adler Barrel.
Yeah,
And
Chris Lehman.
and Chris Lehman. And I actually might move if we're defining it super broadly, I'll move Kevin Mateson, because Kevin Mateson and Chris Lehman are like,
yeah.
they were classmates. So
I see it kind of like the left, when it engages with Lasch, either is usually playing defense, kind of, and this is like Chris Lehman's whole thing, where it's like he knows Lasch, he wants to point out that Lasch is not a conservative or a reactionary, and it's very defensive. It doesn't really go into a lot of the ambiguities. It doesn't go into why Lasch can be interpreted ambiguously, and it doesn't go into him as an intellectual thinker. It goes into like what political projects he was associated with during his life. And I thought like probably the best example of this is the recent Jacobin article from Christian Lorenzen, which is like, why do we keep coming back to Christopher Lasch? Certainly, there is plenty in Lasch to read, but his lasting appeal is due, I think, to a deeper quality in his writing, which just like doesn't engage with the topic at all. And it's a very nice article. It's very well written, but it doesn't talk about anything enduring or lasting about Lasch's intellectual thinking or his politics.
Somebody asked me to have that guy on the show, and I finally got somebody give me that article, and when I read it, I'm like, I think I might, and I don't mean this insultingly, because this person's probably well educated and he's a very good writer, but I'm like, what would I interview him about? I know more about the subject than he seems to know from that article.
He's doing in that article a very different thing than you're doing. But I think it speaks to a broader conception of what to do with Lasch from the left. Like, oh, he's part of our project. Why? I don't know, but his writing's very nice. Like, there's not a deep engagement. And the only people I talked about who have deep engagement are you and Tut, basically. And Lane, when he was going over it with you on Pop the Left. And this is just in published works.
Right. I mean, Lane did one piece where he picked up on True and Only Heaven during his divorce. And, started speculating about gender essentialism and got all mad at Lacanians because they don't take Freud's gender stuff like literally. but which Lasch does. And that's Tut's, psychological complaint is like, that the symbolization of psychoanalytic thought is often quite well understood by Lasch, but that he reads like Mother, Father, and all that like in a way a lot of the American and British psychoanalysts did, but he reads it literally. It's which, for all that I don't love Lacan, Lacanians don't. They read that all symbolically. So it's an interesting thing. I will say this project has gotten me between this and Tut. I've actually read a couple of people who were roughly associated with Lasch. Not Jacoby. The Decline of Public Man. God, what's his name? He also wrote on Public Intellectuals.
Oh, he.
Because there's a Russell Jacoby book on Public Intellectuals, but there's another one. Richard Sennett.
Yeah, Richard
Sennett. I've read more Richard Sennett now, and I've read a lot more Phil Reef, because I'm now realizing that, like, I should also write an essay about how Susan Sontag and Lasch are mirrors of each other. But that Phil Reef is actually as explainable, as important to Lasch's psychoanalytic thinking as Brown. Probably Tut says more so. I'm not sure. Like, I should defer to
stuff. His late stuff is all Reef.
Okay, because I find it interesting. Well, that makes sense, because Reef is like a Freudian sociologist as opposed to a Freudian psychologist. Like,
he has one big examination of Reef in Revolt of the Elites.
Right. But it seems to inform, like, a lot of, like, because digging into Reef, I'm now like, oh, I'm getting where some of these classifications in minimal self and cultural narcissism actually came from. Because for a while I was like, where the hell is this? Is not coming from terror management theory. This is not just him having a pissing match with the Frankfurt School. Like, what is actually going on here? And Phil Reef, particularly Freud, The Mind of a Moralist, is actually helpful in figuring that out. So I'm enjoying this journey. I also had to read a whole lot of Randolph Bourne, which I never knew I was going to do. Bourne. Yeah, I know. He's one of the bohemian left intellectuals that he really respects, which I think when people read New Radicalism, they miss that he does respect Randolph Bourne. He does respect Jane Addams. He does not seem to respect John Dewey. In fact, the more you go through that book, the less he seems to respect people. Like,
yeah, his favorite chapter is the chapter on the war in unanalyzable feeling, where he just like complains about all of the people who he just talked about in the American liberals and the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, which having, when I read the American Rebels and the Russian Revolution, I was like, oh, this is where he writes about all this shit. Like, and you know, there's whole chapters of basically, there's 2 chapters that I could have just entitled in that book, Why Dewey Sucks. Like, it's just, it's although I will also say, in kind of defense of Dewey, he actually doesn't deal with Dewey's Trotskyist adjacent period or his friendliness to Marxism and the nation or any of that. Like, so it's selective, and I'm just gonna, I know that Lasch, when he's writing about education, is very old man yells at cloudsy, but that's the part in his work throughout his life where I never disagree with him. I'm just education today sucks. Like,
yeah, it's the perspective of the teacher, right?
Yeah, and it's all Dewey's fault. Which is kind of, I hate to say it, kind of like, actually, another thing about me when I moved from being a conservative to being a Marxist, which was a 4 or 5 year process, when I kind of broke with conservatism but was lost. But the one thing I never dropped was a hatred of John Dewey. I think maybe, like, that part of Lasch is,
you and Lasch both.
It's just like, we just really hate John Dewey. Like, whenever Lasch is writing about John Dewey, I'm like, yeah, fuck that guy. Like, and he's such a, if you're in education and you hate John Dewey, you are a weirdo. Like it's just like, because like progressive constructivism is the default pedagogy. But anyway, that's for another day. Thank you so much for coming on, Elijah. We're gonna have you back on in 3 or 4 weeks, maybe, to talk. Maybe when you get your mind back, because you did just finish this thesis, and it is late there in Yonkers. Oh, didn't mean to
Sorry, it is late here. My AirPods just completely ran out of battery, so I didn't hear anything. But anyway, thank you very much for having me on your show, because I assume you just did like a closing thing.
Yeah, I just closed out and thanked you. But the other thing I said is we're gonna have you back on to talk about a particular article that somehow manages to butcher John Updike, a writer that I've righted and defended, which I know everyone's gonna go from calling me the white Sean King lookalike to like that dude really is white. He likes John Updike, um, and 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 Lasch, I think, is one of the worst readings of both people somehow that I think I've read in a long time. And we'll release it for patrons. And then maybe over the summer, when you've had some break and you finish up your thesis, we can actually go back and talk about specifically the book of Lasch that almost nobody reads, American Liberals and the Russian Revolution, because I think that book is so important, actually.
Yeah, I can do it anytime after February 15th, because I told myself I'd give myself, other than this podcast, a month off of Lasch thinking. And then go back to it.
I find that when I do podcasts after I've done research for the Lasch book for a lot, that I just like start sounding like I hate him. Like I start like breaking down every argument he makes and like mock him unfairly, and I'm like, I don't even mean this. I'm just tired of fucking reading this shit.
It's exactly that. It's like I mean, it's draining. It gets you really tired. Because just engaging with all like the downfalls in American history, basically. But anyway, thank you very much for having me on. And I'm excited to come back soon to talk about how bad the Lasch and Updike article is, and then something else later.
I normally talk about how First Things is a Christian magazine that does kind of have intellectual standards, but that one is so bad I can't.
You have to read the whole thing. Like, the whole thing is so great, because half of the articles are like the worst articles I've ever read. And this was literally, I was reading this the day before I handed in my final draft of my thesis. So I was like feverishly changing my conclusion to be like, this is terrible. This is awful. And then like a couple of the articles are just like, this is, he was a very nice guy. Like, and so it's just like butchering his intellectual history, or like, he was such a sweet fellow.
The thing inside it, to be fair to Lasch, that is one thing that everybody right and left says about him, is like he was a really, really kind person.
That's one reason I can like live with him in my head for so long, because I don't think he's like a mean guy.
Yeah, don't go on a Mark's quest, my friend, because Ingalls is kind of a bad person too at times, but by our moral standards, but also really charitable and kind in others. But Marx, for his brilliance, and he is brilliant, he's an asshole. I find, like, whenever I'm reading Marx, I just like go on Twitter and I'm like declaring war on everybody and calling everybody Lassallians, and like I'm like breaking out anachronistic insults about political tendencies that no one's thought about for 150 years. Just like, because it gets in my head and I'm just like, God, you're all Lassallians. I hate you all.
You should start doing that more formally, just calling people in the comment section Lassallians.
I used to do that on Twitter. Like, you're a Lassallian, your mom's a Lassallian, and your dad's a Produnist, and you're probably a Bakutinist yourself. How can you be a Lassallian and a Bakutinist? I don't know. It depends on your mood. Those are opposite deviations, but whatever. You're a bad person, and I hate you, and you should die. Also, you're stupid. It's like, because there's a whole lot of Marx's actual political biography is like, he said terrible shit about this person, but then when this person died, he cried and showed up at his funeral. And I was like, yeah, Marx, you're one of those guys.
Well, I do love all of like the stories are like he would just be listless for days on end, and then he would work feverishly, and then he would spend the rest of his time playing with his kids. So he seems like also kind of a fun person, but definitely much more of a curmudgeon.
I think being his daughters, other than the abject poverty part of that, was cool. And also, until the breakdown of the first international, he does seem like he was a good person to work with, actually, when he was on. And yeah, Mark's complicated guy, but because I bring it up because that's the person I read even more than Christopher Lasch. Is like reading every shred of Karl Marx I can get, and then also reading the secondary literature and going like, you guys are making this consistent when it isn't. Are like, me like yelling like, I don't know how you got a PhD where you could say what the plain text of the text says doesn't say that. Like, this doesn't seem like what you get a PhD to do. And they're like, well, that's a basic reading. I'm like, well, I think your reading's made up.
Well, that's actually what you do get a PhD to do.
I remember when somebody yelled at me for like, well, you're just quoting Carl Schmitt. He's really fighting against the political Jews all the way back to Hobbes. And I'm like, yeah, so what? But I'm just quoting what he says in the first chapter because it's also famous, but also it's the fucking thing that defines his politics. So why don't we talk about that? Like, instead of all this weird, esoteric, epistemological minutia that you want to like deal with, so you cannot deal with the fact that Carl Schmitt was a fucking fascist.
Yeah.
And
that's you'll find when you go to the first things thing, it's going to be the same way for Lasch for them, but with Gnosticism.
Oh no! Whenever First Things brings up Gnosticism, it's bad. Like
they have there's like the intro essay is like, Lasch was so brilliant. He had an essay on Gnosticism.
Oh man, is that why they like what's his face, the canon writer? Loved Ashbury. Can't remember his name now.
Things cut out for a second, sorry.
No problem. I was thinking about is that why they also like this guy, the Western canon? Yeah, Harold Bloom. They love Harold Bloom because he also wrote about Gnosticism.
Yeah, they're just they're like, Gnosticism is so dangerous.
Oh man, I love it when you have people trying to apply like 15th century heresiology to like modern politics.
Yeah, they're like, this is the key that unlocks what Lasch was trying to do. He was trying to deal with the repercussions of Gnosticism.
That's Eric von Kuhnlitten. That's like who really was trying to deal with it. Who like thought all of liberalism was really imitizing the eschaton. But that's that's esoteric paleoconservatism. You have to be deep. And actually, by me admitting that I know that, I'm admitting how deep in I was. But
that's okay. That's okay. You're out now.
like we used to be like, well, and actually I was secular at the time, and I was like really struggling with how to deal with all these people really concerned about like Gnostic takeovers, and I'm like, eventually I was like, by Gnostic, do you mean Jew? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Like. But anyway, have a good night, Elisha.
All right. Good night. Thank you so much for having me on.
Bye-bye.